Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank the organizers for having me here. It's a great excuse to finally come to this conference, which is a fantastic one. All right, so today I'm going to talk about internal models and within that probabilistic internal models. So what are internal models? And of course you should never start a talk with a dictionary definition, which is exactly what I'm going to do now. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, internal models are mental representations of the surrounding world. And so the most important thing for me is that internal models are really kind of fundamental to pretty much all aspects of cognition, from low-level vision, where we have knowledge of the physical processes that create the retinal image based on the underlying structure of the environment, and that knowledge allows us to do things like inferring shape from shading. Or in motor control, we have rich internal models of our own bodies as well as the environment, and they allow us to predict the consequences of our movement and to control them adaptively. That's a very rich field of investigation, of course, in cognitive science, all the way to higher level cognition. And this is the kind of stuff that you heard earlier about from Tim Behrens, for example, where we have, where we can organize, for example, semantic knowledge into structures such as a phylogenetic tree, which allows us to predict and generalize properties of animals, for example. And finally, but not least, the staple example of an internal model is the cognitive map that allows efficient navigation through our environments. So all these are just examples, and I could go on and spend the whole 40 or 50 minutes just listing different aspects of cognition by internal models that really allows to kind of predict and generalize and learn in very flexible ways. But I'm a computational neuroscientist or computational cognitive scientist, which fortunately these days there's a decreasing difference between the two. And so what I'm really interested in is how we can formalize how these internal models operate, or how we operate these internal models, how we learn them, how we compute with them. And so for that, I have found over the years that inserting that one word in front of internal models, probabilistic, is a really useful, allows us to use a really powerful toolkit to formalize a lot of the fundamental questions that we are interested in when we talk about internal models. So the basic idea is that you can formalize an internal model using two main components. One is the prior, and that defines your expectations about how the world in general around you kind of behaves and how it is structured. So it defines a probability distribution over all the possible combinations of features and properties that the world might exhibit around you. And then, and objects. And then the second part is the likelihood, which tells us how a particular configuration of objects or features in the world will give rise to, sensory stimuli that you can actually observe. And so the reason why, a formula or couching this in probabilistic terms is so powerful, because we can understand a lot of what cognition is about as having to invert such an internal model, which is sometimes called a generative model, because it tells you how the world generates sensory stimuli. So a lot of cognition can be understood as inverting that relationship, going from sensory stimuli to inferring objects and features, which here I'm denoting by P of y given x. And that inversion, how to do that inversion best, is defined by Bayes' rule and in general the laws of probability. And so essentially what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to unpack different ramifications of this very kind of basic and in some sense deceptively simple idea, and see what consequences they have for different aspects of cognition that we happen to care most about in our research. And so the first thing that, of course, kind of hits you is that this is all well and good, but any inference that you're going to draw, probabilistic or otherwise, is going to be useful only in as much as your internal model has anything to do with the actual world around you. So essentially what you would like is to have an internal model that somehow reflects the true kind of contingencies of the external world. So that's what I'm going to talk about first today, is how we adapt to environmental statistics. And then the next thing that we have been really interested in over the years is how having internal models allows us to behave flexibly across very different tasks. So in some sense, one of the most fundamental tenets of kind of Bayesian models of cognition, and in particular generative models of cognition, is that having such models is really useful because you can use them flexibly across many different tasks rather than simple discriminative learning where in principle you would have to learn a new discriminator in every new task. And so what we are going to, that of course requires us to kind of consider how an internal model interacts with the particular requirements of a task that you're executing and how that gives rise to behavior. But the idea will be is that you can reuse the same internal model in many different situations and kind of flexibly combine with the requirements of the ongoing task. And so we are particularly interested in kind of demonstrating task and modality independence of these internal models. And finally, of course, I'll be talking about this somewhat elusive relationship between all this kind of abstract thinking about Bayesian models of cognition and what actually happens in the brain. And that's been a question of considerable interest to a lot of people in the field. Many of them are in this room now. So I'll tell you about the work that we have done there, kind of trying to explore potential neural substrates of these kind of computations in the brain. So if you have had enough of Bayesian stuff, especially after yesterday's free energy debate, don't worry. Part 3 is actually going to be about neural networks. So there's going to, just bear with me, there's going to be some dynamics in neural networks at the end. If you really don't care about neural networks and want to hear all about Bayesian stuff, well, first of all, the first 2 parts are for you, and actually the third part is also just Bayesian stuff. Okay, so these are kind of the theoretical concepts, and on the way, we will make links to kind of well-established concepts in cognitive science, but hopefully kind of bringing them under a more or less unified framework. So we'll talk about things like scene segmentation, how people form chunks, meaningful chunks of the environment, how we learn about objects. We will look at how we generalize and how what kind of principles may determine at least some aspects of how we move our eyes around. And then we will also be looking at various aspects of neural activities, and in particular the ones that we don't like to care about so much, especially when we learn, when we construct neural network models. These are the last things we want to worry about. And essentially what I'm going to tell you is that there is a framework that allows us to kind of pick up the pieces and put them together into a coherent framework, hopefully. All right. So how do we learn and adapt to environmental statistics? So my venture into Bayesian levels of cognition really started with something which is now quite old, but I thought I would kind of start by telling you about this because I still like it. Joint work with Gergő Orbán, Joseph Fisher, and Dick Astley, more than 10 years ago now. For us, it was an interesting case because Joseph and Dick had already, by that time when we started collaborating, I should say that all the experimental data that I'm going to show today is not from my lab. We are only building theories and computational models, but we collaborate closely with the experimentalists. So in this case, all the kind of heavy lifting experimental work was done by Joseph and Dick. So they had developed a really kind of interesting and rich experimental paradigm that allowed them to study how people learn kind of structured information about the statistics of their visual environments. And the experiment goes roughly like this. It has 2 phases. The first phase is the exposure phase or familiarization phase, and it has minimal instructions. Essentially, subjects are told to pay attention. And then they see a series of visual scenes that are constructed from abstract shapes that look something like this. Okay, and you see maybe 100 or 200 of these, but the whole thing is over pretty quickly, in 10 minutes or so. Then in the second phase, in the test phase, you see pairs of visual scenes, and you have to tell simply which one looks more familiar based on what you had just seen before. And they look something like this. Okay, so the first thing that you will notice is that this task requires considerable generalization because they had not seen any of the particular scenes they were asked to judge in the test phase. Those were not in the exposure sequence. And second, what's really interesting to me about this paradigm is that there's rich statistics to be learned, and I'll tell you exactly what those statistics are in a moment. Yet it allows a very kind of fine control over exactly what those statistics are. And so the trick here is that, unbeknownst to the subjects, there is an inventory of jigsaw pieces that Joseph and Dick used to construct these scenes. In this case, the shapes were arranged into pairs, and each exposure scene was essentially a combination of these different jigsaw pieces, without the colors, of course, as you could see. And then in the test phase, for example, they would make people compare a true pair, which is actually part of the inventory, with a mixture pair. And so the way we started thinking about it, actually inspired by some early work by Nathaniel Doe and colleagues, is that this is a paradigmatic example for a learning, a task for a learning machine, where you have some data. Based on that data, you want to infer what might be the underlying model, generative model that generated that data. And you can pick the maximally probable a posteriori maximally possible model, or you can average if you're really kind of sophisticated. It doesn't really matter, it turns out, in this case, because the posteriors are pretty tight. And then in the test phase, based on the model or models that you've extracted from the data, you can, for example, compute what is the probability that scene A versus scene B happens, and choose the one which you think is more probable based on that model. But the critical thing is that you extract this compressed representation, the internal model of the data that you have seen, and then you act based on that internal model. And so that's where generalization lies. So the key question for us was, what kind of models people learn here, and roughly what kind of principles they use to pick whatever model they learn. And so, the state of the field before this was that people had all sorts of, very sensible sounding heuristics as to what might be happening, and essentially none of them worked. At some point, all of them broke down. And so we thought that maybe this is time to kind of take a step back and ask what would be the right way of doing it. And maybe people just do that, or at least something close to that. So essentially, we compared many models, but I'm just going to tell you about two. Something that we called an associative learner, which learned all about the first and second order statistics of the stimuli, all of them. So, but nothing more, strictly nothing more than that. In technical terms, it's a kind of a second order maximum entropy model of the data. And we contrasted that with Bayesian model selection, where people learn using Bayesian model selection that you could hear about yesterday, the right hidden causal structure of the stimuli. So just to give you more intuition, in associative learning, imagine that you have just these 6 shapes to deal with, and essentially what associative learning is about is that you learn pairwise associations between these shapes, and eventually the hope is that you, in this case, for example, you would learn something like this, that these two are strongly associated, these two are strongly associated, and these two, but the other associations are all much weaker because these two belong to a pair. In contrast to that, our alternative model was that people actually learn a hidden causal structure when they are trying to discover, hidden causes that might coordinate these observations, the shapes. But of course, the added difficulty in that case is that you have to learn how many causes there are and how they are exactly coupled with your observations. So that's kind of a challenging model selection task. But again, if you remain faithful to Bayes' rule, it actually gives you a way to do that properly, applying something that Carl Friston already referred to yesterday as automatic Occam's razor. Okay, and so in the end, in Bayesian chunk learning, you would hope that you discover that there's 3 underlying causes of your observations that are themselves never observed, but you observe their consequences, and they are linked to the appropriate shapes as shown here. All right. So when we compare these two models, Joseph and Dick performed a rich set of experiments using roughly the same paradigm. This is the experiment that I just showed you. The gray bar shows human performance, and the two symbols are the two models. And you can see that they do roughly equally well on explaining that one particular experiment. But then, we went on and looked at pretty much almost all the different variants of the same experiment that Joseph and Dick had done over the years. And so these variants were, I'm not going to give you the details of them, but you can see that they become increasingly sophisticated, both in terms of the inventories that they use and the kind of tests they use. But the bottom line is that these different paradigms, or variants of the same paradigm, were really useful to rule out a lot of other models. And they did give a quantitative advantage to the Bayesian learner, especially considering the fact that the Bayesian learner was fit to all the experiments at once, where the associative learner was fit separately to this experiment and to this experiment and to these experiments. So we had already seen some advantage for the Bayesian learner, but we really wanted to be able to tell them apart in a qualitative way. So we designed that at that point, we didn't just kind of scavenge on old data. We actually designed a new experiment in collaboration with Joseph and Dick. And the experiment went like this. It consisted of two quadruples. The first quadruple is shown here, which was never actually shown as a quadruple. It was only ever shown as a triplet, when we always leave out one of the shapes from that quadruple. And the numbers here show you how many times each of these triplets, embedded triplets, were shown during the course of the exposure phase. The other quadruple, these are 4 different shapes, was sometimes shown as an actual quadruple, and sometimes only individual shapes were shown from it. Of course, they were always combined with some other shapes, either from this quadruple or some kind of other pairs that we introduced for kind of balancing things out. So we still have, all the exposure scenes were compound scenes of many shapes together. But insofar as these quadruples go, these are the relevant frequencies with which different parts of these quadruples were shown. So why is this an interesting design? It was an interesting design because we kind of carefully calibrated it so that we exactly balanced out all the first and second order statistics within these 2 groups of 4 shapes. So if you kind of do the calculation, you can see that every single shape from this quadruple was shown half of the time. And that was the case for the shapes of this quadruple. Any pair of shapes from within this quadruple was shown 1/3 of the time together, or neither of them appeared 1/3 of the time, or only one of them appeared 1/3 of the time. And again, that was also the case for the other group of 4 shapes. So these 2 groups of 4 shapes were exactly balanced for first and second order statistics, which of course was interesting because that's all what the associative learner learns about, and that's pretty much all previously suggested heuristic models of learning were learning about. And so when we then tested people using this paradigm, we saw that both humans and the 2 models were able to distinguish between true triplets and mixture triplets. But interestingly, when we show triplets from this quadruple, the associative learner actually hallucinates a triplet there, because all the pairwise associations here are really strong. But the humans didn't, and neither did the Bayesian learner. Vice versa, when we directly fitted a true triplet here, from here against kind of an embedded triplet here, the humans and the Bayesian learner could make that distinction, whereas for the associative learner there was no difference. So there was no distinction. Okay, so that told us that wow, people really learn fairly difficult statistical environments, and possibly in a way that they extract these latent chunks. So more recently, also collaborating with Daniel Wolpert's group, and still collaborating with Joseph and a very talented PhD student, Gabor, who is not related to me. It's a common last name in Hungary. He's actually sitting somewhere here. We wanted to see whether these chunks that people, these things that we call chunks that we thought extracted during these experiments actually, behaved as at least kind of proto-objects in their cognitive representations. So what we did, and you might be able to guess, if you know Daniel, you might be able to guess what's going to happen now. We combined this kind of experimental paradigm with a motor control or with a sensory motor experiment. So what we did is that we did exactly the same experiment as before. We had an inventory. We exposed people to sequences of scenes constructed from these pairs of inventory. And then we tested them in our usual visual familiarity test. But then we tested them without any experience on that task with these shapes on a pulling task, where essentially the task for subjects was to pull on quadruples, either horizontally and vertically, with the idea that if they really represent these latent variables that we think they extract using Bayesian model selection as little proto-objects, then in this case, for example, a scene like this would be harder to pull horizontally than vertically, because here you have to break both pairs, whereas if you pull vertically, you just need to part them. Okay? Importantly, there was no, the subjects had no experience with this task, with this kind of pairs. So that to us was a strong test of, if you like, zero-shot generalization. Then, of course, Daniel, as he was really daring and said that, well, we should also do the opposite. We should train people using purely haptic contingencies and see whether they generalize to visual familiarity. So we did. So here, of course, you can't not have visual inputs, or at least we couldn't figure out a way how not to do that. So we still had visual information, but importantly, we constructed, and then, of course, we kind of, again, did both kinds of tests. But in this case, we constructed a tricky inventory which had what we called pseudo-pairs, which essentially meant that the pseudo-pairs and the true pairs behaved exactly the same way as far as their visual statistics went, but they were only distinguishable haptically. So here people actually experienced how hard it was to pull on different combinations, and then we tested them in the visual familiar test, in a way that we compared pseudo-pairs and true pairs. So again, the visual statistics were exactly the same. They could only be distinguished based on their haptic statistics that they experienced during this phase. And so, long story short, first of all, we reproduced the basic result in visual statistical learning, that people learn these and generalize to new scenes. But importantly, so this is visual performance. These are individual subjects. But the horizontal axis is haptic performance on the haptic task. And you can see that that's also well above chance. And in fact, there is a strong kind of correlation between the two, which suggests to us, and we did some additional tests, that indeed behavior in these two tasks was based on the same underlying representation. So that's the visual statistical learning, and then we got also similar results in the haptic statistical learning experiment. So that is really cool to us, because that shows that people immediately, not only they extract these latent variables, but they immediately generalize and use them in a completely different task without any experience in that task. All right, so that takes me to the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which is task and modality independence and generalization. Okay, so in particular, what we were interested in is priors. What kind of priors people actually have in their natural environments, and how they use them. And again, the idea of being is that you want a prior to generalize across different tasks, because that's actually when it's becoming useful. And so previously, there was a lot of really interesting work on trying to kind of reverse engineer people's priors from their behavior. But there were two caveats. Well, there was one caveat that had two important consequences for us, which is that essentially all or almost all previous efforts used a single task to estimate what priors people have. And there's two problems with that. First of all, at the end of the day, a prior is just a bunch of free parameters, and of course, with enough free parameters, we know we can fit an elephant and make it wiggle its trunk. And so that's a problem, that maybe we're just fitting a bunch of free parameters, and there's no such a thing as a prior. The other problem is that, again, we are really interested in whether people generalize across tasks, and if you get a prior from a single task, we have no way of telling that. So in order to look at this, we once again collaborated, in this case, with Daniel Wolpert's group and some really smart machine learning students. So we made people perform two tasks. Again, there was no notion of correctness in these tasks. So there was no supervision, there was no feedback given. One task asked them to compare two faces on the screen that we kind of rendered for them. So in each trial, they had to compare two faces and tell which one looked more familiar to them. In the other task, they saw three faces and needed to say which one looked like the odd one out. So which one was most dissimilar from the other two. These are two different tasks. Also, kind of in post-hoc analysis, we made sure that people did not use the same strategy in the two tasks. So, for example, they didn't just choose the face that was most or least familiar in the odd one out task. So these are two really different tasks. And so what we were wondering is whether we can reverse engineer the priors over faces that subjects use in these two tasks, and whether we can see how different or similar they are. So we kind of developed a method which we coined cognitive tomography, which is essentially a doubly Bayesian method where you have a Bayesian ideal observer of the subject's behavior, and then you use Bayesian inference to infer all the parameters of that ideal observer model that you can't observe directly, such as the priors that people are using. So we did that, and so this is what we got. So we have a two-dimensional abstract feature face in which we can kind of parameterize all the faces that we used in the experiment. It's not an eigenface space. It's like it has to do with doing principal component analysis on the three-dimensional structure of faces. This is not our work. This is work that had been done by others. So in any case, these are the first two principal components of the three-dimensional structural feature face feature space of faces. And so this is one of our subjects in one of the tasks. This is the prior that we estimated based on their behavior in that one task. And you can already see that it's kind of interesting. It's structured. It doesn't look like a simple Gaussian blob. I'll get back to that point in a moment. Here is subject one in the same task, and you can already see, for example, that they have quite different priors. So a lot of earlier work kind of worked on the tacit assumption that people will have roughly the same priors in a number of domains. It turns out that apparently for human faces we don't seem to have the same prior. Each of us seems to have a kind of a prior on our own. So there were differences across subjects, but then when we looked at the priors that the same subjects used in the other task, what we saw is that actually there was a great deal of similarity across tasks within subjects. And so we did this overall with 10 subjects. You can see that the similarity works really well up until here. And I can tell you that we actually ordered subjects based on a model-free measure of how noisy their behavior was. So these are the least noisy subjects, and these are the most noisy subjects. So here we should probably not rely too much on these results because we are probably just reading tea leaves. But up here, these are pretty reliable estimates, we think. So so that's interesting. So people seem to use the same prior across different tasks. But the real proof of the pudding to us is whether you can then predict behavior. So what we do is the thing that you should always do is do when you estimate a hidden quantity is to do cross-validation, right? So what we did is that we extracted people's priors from a subset of the trials and then predicted their behavior on the kind of left-out set of trials. And so here are again subjects ranked by their noisiness or reliability, least noisy to most noisy. And you can see that we can predict. So this is not their fraction correct, because remember, there was no notion of correctness for them in the task. This is our fraction correct of predicting their behavior, right? And so what you can see is that we predict behavior well above chance in both tasks. And in fact, based on how noisy they were, we were able to derive a theoretical upper bound on how well it is theoretically possible to predict people's behaviors. And so that's the black line here. And you can see that we are pretty close up there near that boundary. So essentially, we predict their behavior as technically possible, given their fundamental noisiness of their behavior. OK, now the really hard cross-validation, of course, is to see whether we can extract their priors in one task and predict in the other task without having seen their behavior in that other task. And again, we could do that very well, way above chance, and sometimes as well as within tasks. So for us, that was a really strong form of cross-validation. These are the group averages. These are individual subjects. These are group averages. And so you can see that we are doing a pretty good job in both tasks, both in terms of within and across task cross-validation. So this framework also allowed us to ask a few interesting questions. For example, I showed you earlier that these priors tend to be pretty structured in that two-dimensional feature space. Is that structure real, or is it just kind of us overfitting our model? And so the way we kind of wanted to operationalize that question is, can we predict equally well if we replace every prior that we estimated with a moment-matched Gaussian, right? Which would have no structure beyond second order. And so that would be, that's a cartoon to illustrate that idea. Here is the original distribution. Here is the kind of the moment-matched Gaussian fit. And the answer is no, we can't predict as well. So that tells us that that structure, at least some of that structure, is real and is really helping us predict people's behavior better. These are, again, group averages. These are individual subjects, moment-matched prediction versus original prediction. And you can see that pretty much all the subjects are on or above that line. The other test that we did, which is probably the one that I like most, which is our way of settling the behaviorism versus cognitivism debate once and for all in a quantitatively well-defined manner, which is that, okay, well, at the end of the day, we just built a really complicated predictor that goes from the stimuli that people see to predicting their behavior, right? That's behaviorism, or stimulus response, right? And at the end of the day, that's what we did. So we thought that, okay, well, we can take kind of a cutting-edge, kind of discriminative predictor of responses based on stimuli, a GP classifier, a Gaussian process classifier, and use that to predict people's behavior. Now, of course, in the limit of infinite data, you cannot beat a GP classifier if you use a sensible covariance function for that GP, which we did. But the important point is that with limited amount of data, if our prior assumption that people have actual priors that we estimate is useful, then with limited amounts of data, we should be able to beat the GP classifier. And so we did. And of course, the GP classifier had no way of doing cross-task prediction, but we beat, at least in one of the tasks, we beat it significantly. In the other task, not quite. But there was still a trend there. And in fact, in some cases, we would beat it equally well, even in a cross-task prediction. So if you ever wondered, this is the end of the cognitivism versus behaviorism debate. It's all solved. Okay. I'm going to skip this part because I really want to save some time for the last part of the talk. So if you're interested in how we can use the same ideas to explain at least some aspects of eye movements and how we use eye movements for active sensing, again, something that came up yesterday in the free energy principle, although we didn't need free energy per se, we just used good old-fashioned Bayesian active learning or Bayesian active sensing, and how that, again, kind of shows us signatures of people using the same internal models in two completely different tasks in some way. One is how to choose between different pattern categories, and the other is how to move their eyes, which they don't even think about probably. Then go and read this paper that we wrote about it. I'm happy to answer questions about this, but at the end of the talk. But let me now go to the last part. Okay. So I promised that in the end I will be talking a little bit at least about neural substrates. So essentially what I'm going to tell you about is that there's different reasons why you might be interested in this very last part of the talk. We think that we have a theory that gives us a nice unifying account for some ubiquitous aspects of cortical activity that people at least computational neuroscience people who think about function, at least, don't really want to think about most of the time. Variability in neural responses, spontaneous activity, oscillations, transients, all those are usually considered as nuisances when you want to do some computationally useful operation. And essentially what we show here is that they kind of fall out of the same underlying framework. If you are And this is the moment for the neural networks people. If you're interested in training neural networks for some function, then this is a way for you to finally get realistic and rich dynamics in those networks. Because I would argue that a lot of the interesting aspects of cortical activity don't tend to be reproduced by those networks. Again, I'm in particular thinking of these aspects. And if you're a person who, such as myself, who cares about neural representations of uncertainty, again, I think. Myself included, absolutely, the models that we are building for how neurons might represent probabilistic information or probabilistic computations has been really lacking some of the richness of cortical dynamics. So again, this is a way for us to bring these two fields together. So the basic idea here, and this is what Ralph very kindly referred to in his introduction as the sampling hypothesis, is that the question that we are asking, how are these Bayesian posterior distributions that are so fundamental to any Bayesian model of cognition, how might these actually be represented in neural activity? What should, if you are a neurophysiologist, what should you do? What should you measure to see signatures of probabilistic representations? And so the idea is the following. Let's, for a moment, because everything that we have done here so far is about V1, so very, very simple stuff. Let's for a moment think about a very simple generative model of natural image patches, really, not full images. These are just small image patches. And the idea here is that a reasonable and a widely used class of internal models for natural image patches assumes that you have some latent variables that combine linearly. Each latent variable might be would be associated with a so-called projective field. So the latent variable would tell you what is the intensity with which that projective field is present in the image. So essentially that means that you're combining these projective fields linearly, where the coefficients are the activations of these latent variables, and that would generate you, with the right choice of projective fields, that would generate little kind of natural image patches. So that's not a bad first or perhaps zeroth order approximation of the statistics of natural image patches, and there had been a lot of really interesting work before us on that. So we are by no means the people who have really driven the field in this regard. So think of sparse coding or think of something else that I'm going to tell you about in a moment. Okay, then of course the job of the brain is not to generate images, although we might sometimes, and you might be generating some images right now if you're too bored with the lecture, but usually the job of the brain is to invert this model, and that's what we call, in psychology and cognitive science, that's what we call an ideal observer model, to invert these models and infer a posterior distribution over possible activations of the latent variables given the input, the image or the image patch. And so the important thing here is that we never know for sure, so we have to express our uncertainty. And again, the mathematically correct way of expressing your uncertainty is to formalize it as a posterior distribution over all possible combinations of latent variable activations that might account for your sensor input. Okay, so far this is exactly what I was telling you about. There is no neurons in there yet, right? So this is just ideal observer land. But now we can go over to, say, a piece of cortex, in this case V1, where we have interconnected networks of excitatory and inhibitory cells that are driven by the stimulus through some feed-forward receptive fields, and they express some activities. And the idea is that we can trace these activities in state space over time, and you might see something that one of our reviewers once very kindly called a spaghetti, which I think is a really nice way of expressing this. So spaghetti, this kind of trajectory in state space that these cells express. And so the idea is that we want to interpret this noisy dance of activities in state space as representing the appropriate posterior distribution by giving us samples from that distribution. So essentially, what we assume is that if we can identify the kind of latent variables that each of these cells might represent, then the distribution of activities that they express over their state space should match the posterior distribution that an ideal observer would be inferring. And importantly, of course, the reason why it's a really tall order is that if you have a different input, your ideal observer will infer a different posterior, and your neural network will express a different distribution of activities. And again, we require a match between the two. So it's the same neural network, and we require it to generate just the right distribution of activities for every single input, at least approximately. So, in technical terms, this is amortized variational inference using a sampling-based or a Monte Carlo representation of the posterior. All right. So, we suggested that this might be happening in the brain way back a number of years ago, but of course we were kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. So if you go back to the early neural networks literature, there's already traces of this, and even a kind of more proximal to our proposal. Other people have actually quite explicitly suggested it, but then somehow they didn't follow it up as kind of stubbornly as we did. And that ever since then, a lot of people, and several of them are actually in this room now, have worked on different possible kind of ways of testing this idea that we represent probabilities through samples. What we have been doing over the years is to really look for neural correlates, even in V1, for how this might be happening. Okay, so in particular, what we are going to use here is something that is called the Gaussian scale mixture model for the generative model and the ideal observer model, pioneered by Simoncelli and colleagues. There's reasons why we think that's a good class of models, and in particular, we think that's a good class of models because we were able to show previously that if you infer posteriors under that class of generative models, then those posteriors explain a host of different things, aspects of stationary distributions of neural activities. But importantly, that did not require us to specify the dynamics that achieves those stationary response distributions. So really, we had not said anything about dynamics at that point. In the red corner, we are going to consider a particular class of neural network models, which is called the stochastic stabilized supralinear network, based on previous work by Ken Miller and colleagues, Yashar Ahmadian and Dan Rubin, and also more recently us collaborating with them, showing that this class of models, if you have the right parameters, can really explain a lot of interesting aspects of response variability in V1. So these are completely bottom-up mechanistic models, and they don't tell you anything about functions. So essentially what we wanted to do is to link these two words and say that, can we show that these models, rather than us choosing carefully the right parameters, actually arise if you optimize a neural network for doing sampling-based inference under this class of models. So we did what many of you do these days. We took a neural network and trained it to do the thing. What's different from the way we do it, from the way most of you are probably doing it, is that we, first of all, this is a really nasty class of type of neural networks, because there is these expansive nonlinearities in every single neuron. So these networks can really become unstable very, very easily. So inhibition is key. And that's exactly what all this previous work had shown, how by having just the right kind of inhibition in these networks is important, and what kind of interesting phenomena it can give rise to. But now our hands are tied. We can't just set the inhibition. We have to train it on this task and hope that it will work. But one reason why it's so hard is that if you don't do your training well, the networks just explode and end of story. The other reason why it's difficult, the way we do it, and you can say that we are a bit masochistic, but we are in the hope of getting something out of it, is that we are, of course, training this network not only in the usual way where you require this network to do something kind of sensible on average. In fact, most of the time, people use trial average data either to train their networks or to compare their networks to data. But we really want the moment-by-moment behavior of this network to do something meaningful for us. So the way we do that is that we minimize, we train these networks to moment match the posterior of the ideal observer model. So for every single input in our training set, we have the target mean that is inferred by the ideal observer model, and we have the mean of activities in the neural network. Same for the covariance, and we have another term which turns out to be not so important, that encourages small autocorrelations. And so essentially so this is our objective function that we train the network on. So we want the network to match both the means and the covariances of the posteriors of the ideal observer model. And the parameters are we have a pretty, and this is one aspect in which we are much simpler than what most of you guys might be doing, is that we have a very low-dimensional parameterization of the input noise covariance of the network, but importantly, that input noise is stimulus independent, so we are not cheating, we are not putting all the interesting stuff in the input noise. Feed-forward nonlinearity of these neurons and recurrent weights. And so when we do that, first thing, a sanity check, we reproduce at least qualitatively the steady-state behaviors of simple cells in V1. And we kind of knew that because that's exactly our earlier work, that if you represent the posterior under the Gaussian scale mixture model, at least approximately, then you do reproduce the stationary response properties of V1 simple cells, both in terms of their mean firing rates, so that's kind of what is called a tuning curve, usually, and in terms of how their variability is tuned by stimuli, both by the orientation of stimuli, mildly, and by the contrast level. So this is spontaneous, this is 100% contrast of the stimuli. So that's kind of that's kind of a sanity check. But the really interesting thing, one thing that we did not train the network on explicitly is the dynamics by which it gets to those stationary response distributions. And when we look at those, what we see is that our model expresses oscillations in the gamma bands, of which the frequency is modulated by the contrast of stimuli, just as people have found in experiments, quite kind of broadly. And also we have stimulus onset transients. So this is when the stimulus is on, it is displayed at time 0, and you see a pretty large transient both in the model and in the experiment, which is also contrast dependent, its amplitude. And these transients are actually inhibition modulated if you look inside our EI cells, or the individual excitatory and inhibitory currents onto individual neurons. Okay, importantly, and this is the last thing that I'm going to show, is that you might say that, well, you know, this is a complicated dynamical system, excitatory inhibitory networks that we are training. So of course you get oscillations and transients. How could you not get these? You know, we all know since Wilson and Kahn that excitatory inhibitory neurons do all these kind of things. So what we thought was a really interesting control to do is to take exactly the same network, exactly the same architecture, and train it exactly in the same way as we did previously, with one change, is that we knocked out the terms that cared about the second order aspects of the target distributions that we wanted our network to match, right? But it's exactly the same EI network fundamentally. And so when we did that, again, we reproduce the same tuning curves. That's good, right? Because we still want it to match the means of the posteriors. It turns out that now the fan effectors, variability is not modulated anymore. So that's already interesting to us because it tells you that you don't get modulation of variability, which is kind of a fundamental signature of a sampling-based representation. You don't get modulation of variability for free unless you train the network specifically for it. And more importantly, we don't get oscillations, so the power spectra have no peak at gamma, and we don't get any transients. And we then went on and showed that these are not just epiphenomena in our network, but these are actually functionally useful for speeding up sampling-based inference in various ways. But I don't have time to tell you about that in more detail, so come and ask me if you're interested. Okay, so what's left is to quickly summarize what I've told you about. I'm not going to read that out in the interest of time. The most important thing, I want to acknowledge all my fantastic collaborators, both within Cambridge and outside Cambridge. And particularly, I would like to thank people who very generously share their data publicly so that we can come and kind of scavenge on it and reuse it or recycle it in ways that are interesting for us and hopefully for the community, but without which we would not have been able to do any of this work on the neural side. And of course, the generous funding from the Wellcome Trust, the ERC, and the FSP. And while you're thinking about questions, I would just like to announce that we have postdoc openings both in Cambridge and in Budapest, which is soon going to become Vienna. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions.
Hey, Máté, what a super broad-ranging talk. Thanks very much. So I think maybe I'm going to ask you about what you didn't tell us at the very end. So I guess what I want to know is, are the samples in that thing very autocorrelated, or do the gammas let it jump around yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that's exactly the right intuition. We can do some math about it. But essentially, the basic idea is that, of course, in neuron, what you want in principle in Markov chain Monte Carlo, so when you represent posteriors through samples, is for those samples to be as independent as possible. In fact, you don't even want independence. It turns out you want carefully titrated anti-dependence or anti-correlation. And it turns out that gamma oscillations do just that, and in a really interesting way. And that explains why their frequency also scales as well. Ralph, do we have time for one more question? There's another question.
Another question? Oh.
I was trying to extract from the last slide exactly what we should measure for a variance effect. And is the oscillations in conductance that you showed at the bottom, how does that change I saw the oscillations were much higher when you had the variance in the functional, but how does that vary with contrast, for example, and what would you recommend, I guess, as sort of the first thing to go after in
So the
terms of
first thing to
measurement?
go after, thanks for the question. So the first thing to go after is to see whether situations in which, based on behavior or some really kind of sensible assumptions that you can make, under situations when you think your subjects are more uncertain, neural variability using the right measure should increase. And of course, you should control for kind of trivial effects of variability going up with finite grade. So that's why we use, just as the rest of the field uses Fano factors for spike counts rather than just row variability. So that's the first thing to check. And then if you have passed that hurdle, or not you, it's the theory that passes that hurdle, I guess. If the theory passes that hurdle, then the next thing to look for is indeed whether you have these transients at stimulus onset with scale, with some notion of the strength of the stimulus. I don't know what kind of paradigm you are using. If it's a visual paradigm, contrast is an obvious thing, but there's many other ways in which you can possibly manipulate, and then oscillations would be another thing. So you can look for oscillations and whether, again, their frequency grows under conditions when the certainty increases. That's the basic assumption or prediction.
Let's thank Máté again.
Thank you very much.